First of all, I want to thank the organizer and the center for inviting me to give a lecture on the topic of my PhD dissertation. I will spend the next 40 minutes or so outlining first the origin of quarantine and quarantine centers. Then I will focus on the theories of contagion, the materiality of goods quarantined, and how they were shared and how they shaped preventative practices inside the institution and what they can tell us about early modern medical frameworks. So plague was, of course, a continuous threat during the early modern period. From the Black Death until the beginning of the 19th century, Europe was regularly ravaged by outbreaks. Those cities that were recurrently hit by epidemics and whose economies highly relied on the movement of goods and persons soon understood the importance of prevention. Quarantine is indeed almost as old as the Black Death. The Adriatic city of Ragusa, today's Dubrovnik, adopted quarantine legislation in 1377 by admitting or denying entry to travelers based on the state of health of the region of provenance. And I'm sure that after the experience of COVID in the last few years, you all know one thing or two on quarantine, but here I will give just a brief introduction. So quarantine is a preventative measure intended to stop the spreading of the diseases through the temporary isolation of travelers, animals, and goods coming from infected regions. It is important to stress that quarantine is a preventative and permanent measure independent of the state of local health. Integral to the concept of quarantine is its continuous application beyond epidemics to apparently healthy subjects and potentially infected goods before the disease can manifest itself. The application is therefore based on the state of health of the region of provenance of goods and people. The name, as you might know, derives from the Italian word quaranta, that is 40, which refers to the number of days of isolation prescribed. And while the number has strong religious associations, the duration of quarantine could vary considerably. And for instance, Ragusa initially adopted a month of quarantine, while later in several Mediterranean cities, the period isolation could vary between 15 days and 40 days or more. Quarantine required a site in which people and goods could be safely isolated, and Ragusa initially used several temporary sites. In 1423, Venice founded the first permanent quarantine station and plague hospital, later known as Lazzaretto Vecchio, on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth, which was previously used as a monastic site. And it is possible still to trace the origin of the institution in the word Lazzaretto, that is a corruption of Nazareth into Nazzaretto. And this terminology is used spelled with an N until the end of the 16th century. In 1456, Venice established another quarantine station and plague hospital in the lagoon, the Lazzaretto Nuovo. It was used during outbreaks to isolate those who had contact with sick people and those recovering from the disease. In non-plague years, as with the Lazzaretto Vecchio, it was employed to quarantine incoming travelers, merchants, and their goods. And as it was further located away from the city compared to the Lazzaretto Vecchio, it was used to quarantine the most dangerous cargo and people. Venice was hit by its last plague outbreak in 1630, and in the centuries to come, the quarantine function overtook that of the hospital. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Venice also established several lazzaretti in its territories, in the Adriatic and Ionian Sea and the terraferma, constituting a system of several quarantine centers. The Lazzaretti of Venice in the lagoon were at the center of a network that reached from the mainland, for instance, Verona and Bergamo that we can see here, and also Pontebba further in Friuli. And this network reached also the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, other Mediterranean states such as the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, the Genoese Republic, France, Malta, and the Kingdom of Naples started adopting Lazzaretti and quarantine to protect their territories from the risk associated with commerce and plague. The Venetian system was thus progressively linked to other Lazzaretti, becoming a transnational network against plague. And because the plague transcended national borders, it required a transnational preventative system. Quarantine to be effective required knowledge, information, and uniformity of procedures, as each city and state could not fight the battle against the disease alone. For early modern states, the health of neighboring regions was almost as important as their own, as affirmed by Lodovico Antonio Muratori in his treatise Del Governo della Peste, published in 1714. Muratori wrote, when this terrible disease is heard to be ravaging countries close to Italy, or in such position that could it pass to our cities, it is appropriate to defend oneself, and join with bordering neighbors and the other Italian cities in order to prevent its entry in Italy. The precautions adopted by a province or a border city in this case are not only to defend it, but also to defend the other cities that lie behind. Indeed, the laws of nature and of people obligate us to a similar defense, also for their neighbor health, end quote. It was also essential that trading partners and strategic territories monitored their own borders. The consequence of carelessness was not only plague, but also economic repercussions, as failure to participate in this coordinated system meant the potential banishment from commercial activities or being subject to long period of quarantine. Thus, a shared system and effort against the plague were essential. This took the form of a vast communication network between the Mediterranean and European health boards, which would regularly inform other states or territories banned from commerce, and their subsequent release, and would send updates in case of localized plague outbreaks. The information shared across the Mediterranean on the presence of the plague was essential for the adoption of one of the key elements of quarantine regulation, that is, health passes. As analyzed by Alex Bamji, health passes were usually standardized printed forms, filled in by hand and issued by civic health boards, or in case of the Ottoman lands, by consuls of specific nations. They could be released to single travelers without payment and under a charge to the captain of a ship as a combined certificate for crews, passengers, and cargoes, or for goods only. The information that they conveyed was standardized. They certified the good health of the city or port of provenance for travelers' goods and livestock. Health passes were used not only for quarantine purposes, but were widely checked at city gates, borders, and customs to determine whether or not travelers would be permitted to enter cities and cross borders. In the case of quarantine centers, health passes were essentially to determine if people or goods needed to be quarantined and the length of isolation, which were established according to news of plague abroad. The use of health passes and the application of quarantine thus relied on up-to-date information on the state of health of different Mediterranean areas. However, it is also important to underline that quarantine especially targeted ships, people, and cargo coming from the Ottoman territories. Indeed, quarantine was developed especially by seafaring states and cities where trading activities with the Ottoman Levant were fundamental. The reason why quarantine was needed, especially when trading, may seem obvious, especially after the current pandemic, but it nonetheless requires two intertwined explanations deeply rooted in the early modern theory of plague and contagion. The adoption of permanent and preventative quarantine centers by Western Mediterranean states was based on the idea of a perpetually diseased Levant as opposed to a healthy West. Indeed, trading with the Ottoman Empire and the Barbary Coast was considered always a risk which needed to be mitigated. There were both practical and cultural reasons for Western perception of the Levant as disease, which were also part of a proto-Orientalist discourse contraposing Christian Europe to the infidel East. First of all, the early modern theory of contagion and medical theories adopted by health authorities and doctors argued that plague often originated in the east and then moved westward. Secondly, Europeans also harshly condemned the lack of preventative public health measures against the plague in Ottoman cities. And trading and communication with the Ottoman Levant constituted a constant risk, while the lack of protection underlined the uncertainty in trading with these territories that could be potentially infected. And early modern medical theories of contagion and plague connected putrefaction, the quality of the air, the presence of miasma and food odors to outbreaks of the disease. The hot and humid climate of the eastern and southern parts of the Mediterranean was considered especially unsafe by European medical treatises. We can find evidence of this notion already in antiquity, especially in Hippocratic treatises, Airs, Waters, and Places, and this notion was also further developed during the early modern period. The alleged Levant's fault in exporting the disease is especially evident in 18th century treatises on quarantine and plague. And Muratori affirmed that, quote, the most recent plagues of Italy and Europe spread either due to someone's negligence from Africa to the Christian islands of the Mediterranean and then entered the continent, or coming from the Orient, penetrating inside Hungary, Dalmatia, Poland, and other borderlands with the Turk, it afflicted other parts of our Europe, end quote. He also continued, quote, above all the states under Turkish rule, I am going to say, are a perpetual seminary of plague, and any trade is always dangerous with those countries, end quote. And the source of uncertainty towards the state of health of the Levant was also caused, as I said, by the Ottoman Empire alleged drastic refusal to adopt specific preventative practice against the plague. According to Western treatises, Muslim countries' belief in predestination and fatalism played a pivotal role in undermining the adoption of quarantine due to the debates about its religious legitimacy. However, it's important to highlight that the disposition on predestination was not universal in the Muslim world, and indeed the religious debate on predestination had a long tradition and was very dynamic. Nunket Varlik, has also proved how plague pushed the Ottoman Empire in developing its public health system in the 16th century. Nonetheless, the lack of plague preventative practices in predominantly Muslim areas was seen as especially despicable by Western authors. And indeed, Muratori emphasized again that in Constantinople and in other cities of the Turk, these infections are especially disliked and neglected. So for this reason, trade with the Levant was always feared, as underlined by Richard Mead in a short discourse concerning pestilential contagion, which was commissioned by the British Privy Council during the 1720 plague outbreak in Marseille. Mead wrote that, quote, plagues seem to be of the growth of the eastern and southern parts of the world and to be transmitted from them into colder climate by the way of commerce, end quote. And indeed, here we come to the second key element to understand the necessity for quarantine, the threat posed by the trading of goods from areas that were believed potentially infected, such as the Ottoman Empire. To explain how objects and goods were considered responsible to import the disease abroad, we have to look at contemporary ideas on plague and contagion. And to analyze these issues, as I will explain in the next few minutes, we need to place the materiality of the goods at the core of research. I argue that this analysis is essential to understand the institution, the amount of effort and coordination required, and how quarantine centers, and also to understand how quarantine centers functioned. Indeed, what I underlined in the first part of my talk, the importance of the transnational collaboration, the existence of a system of different Lazzaretti and health boards sharing news, have been already underlined by other scholars, first by Daniel Panzas's work in the 80s, and more recently by works on Mediterranean quarantine by Alex Chase Levinson, and works on the impact of the 1720 plague of Provence in the Mediterranean and Atlantic context by Cindy Hermos. However, I also argue that it's also essential to have a deep understanding of the early modern theory of contagion, the properties associated with specific materials, to start delving into the cultural history of the institution. And the early modern theory of contagion was largely based on ideas established in the antiquity by the Greek author Galen, and plague was believed to spread through miasmata, that is bad air. However, Galen also introduced the idea of seeds of the disease to explain how plague entered the body. These seeds were recalled by Girolamo Fracastoro in 1546 in his treatise De Contagione. His theories became very popular during the early modern period and widely adopted. These were also referenced throughout the 17th and 18th century, on which I focused my research. Fracastoro explained the transmission of the disease as happening in 3 different ways: through contact with the sick, through fomites, that is, contaminated objects in which the seeds are preserved on surfaces, and at distance, caused by poisonous vapors, the miasma that I was mentioning before. The scholarship of plague in the early modern period has explicitly considered the importance of miasma, the sense of smell, and how the fear of foul odors was linked to urban sanitation and specific legislation adopted to promote a salubrious and miasma-free environment. The role of bad air has been also investigated in relation to space of healing, especially early modern hospitals, whose architecture was designed to promote ventilation. Lazzaretti were also built with these concerns in mind, stressing the needs for cleanliness, taking advantage of local winds and sources of water for the functionings of the sewers to remove foul odors. However, I argue here that in the case of quarantine centers, the relationship between contagion, the materiality of objects, and the sense of touch also played a major role in the adoption of quarantine and its regulations. And I want to focus on the second type of contagion through objects, which was indeed the one that was considered the most dangerous in the context of quarantine and trade, as we can see here in the words of the chief medical personality in Aleppo, Patrick Russell. Quote, "This contagion per fomitem, as it is termed, is of more extensive influence than either of the two. The distemper is transported to great distances from one region to another. When the infectious miasmata happen to adhere to merchandise, which is soon close packed up, they retain their vigor unimpaired for a long while, and in that state are transported to other countries." End quote. In the context of Mediterranean trade, with extensive contact with the Levant, contagion through objects was considered more dangerous than infected air or people. And as Russell has underlined, goods could indeed be transported from infected regions over long distances and be still actively contagious over a long time. And within this framework, we need to situate the institution of quarantine and the practices adopted inside. Because of the level of coordination between different health offices, these were similar in different quarantine stations across the Mediterranean. So in general, goods arriving inside quarantine stations were ventilated, fumigated with perfume or also washed with seawater, depending on their material. The type of disinfection treatment did not only avoid ruining the goods, but they were also chosen because different materials were believed to be more or less contagious, depending on their ability to retain the seeds of the disease. The study of quarantine procedures is essential to understand a complex attitude towards materials, their surfaces, their medical properties, and their interaction with the body. While medical treatises of the time are useful to understand how contagion generally was believed to work, they do not provide details on how different types of materials absorb the seeds of the disease. On the other hand, if we turn to the quarantine prescriptions and the regulations produced by health offices all over the Western Mediterranean, we can understand much about contemporary attitudes to materials which are not only relevant for the preventative side of plague, but also during plague times. So let's turn to some of the documentation produced by a variety of health offices concerning the quarantine of goods. Several reports found in Health Board's archives managing Lazzaretti divide the materials into those more likely or less likely to carry the contagion. Items were usually divided into suscettibili or soggetti, subject to contagion, and into those which were not considered subject to contagion or insuscettibili. The key distinguishing characteristic between the two categories was the quality of the surface. Porous materials were considered more dangerous, while smooth surfaces were considered safer. Giovanni Gentili, medical officer of the Health Board in Livorno, listed in 1783 some of the features which could facilitate the transmission of contagion. And we have porosity, hardness, coarseness, tenacity, and viscosity. In Italian, porosità, villosità, scabrosità della superficie, tenacità o viscosità. Additionally, suggested that processed and macerated vegetal and animal substances, above all if furry, using the words villose, ricoperte di peli, which were porous, were among the most dangerous. And in Genoa, goods were divided into three categories. And here you can see the document divided in three columns according to these three categories. We have goods that do not receive infection, non ricevono infezione, goods that receive infection, ricevono infezione, and goods that are suspected of receiving infection, suspected infezione. The Genoese document, probably from the late 17th century, describes very vividly the surfaces of goods. For example, meat, well peeled and flayed, ben pelata e scorticata, was considered safe, while fruits with a bloomy and crinkly outer shell, guscio esteriore lanuginoso e crespo, were considered subject to contagion. On the other hand, mushy, leveled, wrinkled, and uneven bodies, corpi molli, rasi, rugosi, et ineguali, silk and textile that is frayed with threads in relief, sfrangiati e simil col pelo rilevato, and wood which was old, worm-eaten, rugged, creased, and uneven, that is, legnami vecchi e tarlati, gli aspri, rugosi, e diseguali, were listed among the materials that received the contagion. On the other hand, smooth merchandise such as beeswax, metals, glass, china, and polished hardwood were considered safer if generally clean. The fear of fomites and the systematic division of objects into susceptible and non-susceptible did only regard quarantine procedures inside Lazzaretti, but it had been long applied to objects during plague outbreaks. Generally, cloth was always considered with suspicion during plague outbreaks, and pieces of contaminated cloth are often indicated in the documents as the culprit in starting plague outbreaks across the 17th and 18th centuries. And for example, the plague in Marseille and also the plague in Florence in 1630. Preventative measures during outbreaks included restriction on the sale of cloth, while the trade of second-hand textiles and objects was often banned. Apart from cloth, other materials with porous and sticky surfaces were regarded as highly suspicious. For instance, during the epidemic in Florence in 1630, churches were cleared of ex votos made usually metal, wood, or papier-mâché, or also wax, probably because they were believed to potentially spread the contagion. It also appeared that the list of susceptible and non-susceptible materials was widespread knowledge. In Ancona, the acquaintance with the type of suspicious goods, as affirmed in a report from the Health Board, was, quote, common among the most idiot persons, end quote. From the documents regarding the quarantine goods inside Lazzaretti, it is clear that porous surfaces such as cotton, wool, silk, paper, fur, and feathers were considered extremely dangerous and were carefully quarantined and disinfected inside the lazzaretto. These often also constituted the majority of goods that were traded between the eastern and western part of the Mediterranean and were considered with much suspicion as they came from the Ottoman Empire. Thus, the aim of the transit of goods through Lazzaretti was their disinfection, as they came from supposedly infected lands and they were believed to be easily contagious. Disinfection of dangerous goods was achieved in different ways. Dangerous goods were disinfected at length and quarantined for longer, and the procedure often started on the ship where the goods were ventilated before they were completely unloaded in the lazzaretto. Once inside, they would receive further treatments. The regulations adopted inside Lazzaretti over the Venetian territories prescribed the opening of every bale of cotton, wool, and linen. Textiles were piled up and turned over periodically to allow the air to pass through the pile and between every single item. Raw cotton was ventilated by opening only one side of the bags and by having porters put their naked arms inside the bale and turn over the cotton periodically. In other instances, such as Marseille, the bales of cotton were left in the open air, lined up on custom-made benches that you can see here on the right, which were situated in the Lazzaretto's courtyard. The bales of goods were also often fumigated with a mix of sawdust and sulfur. Again, in Marseille, a specific room was used to hang up the goods, usually textiles, in order to fumigate them. Paper was also considered extremely contagious and was treated with suspicion. Most of the archival collection of letters sent from Lazzaretti to health board offices were the marks of disinfection, as they were sent from a potentially infected environment to the outside world. They show the marks of different procedures, such as fumigation in the two documents on the sides, for example. The sprinkling of vinegar in the center, we have an El Paso that was sprinkled with vinegar, but also a form of slitting, that is opening the letter, making some cuts in order to have the content being disinfected. Many Lazzaretti were equipped with special instruments and rooms for fumigations of small objects made of paper. And the Lazzaretti in Trieste, Livorno, and Messina were fitted with rooms with fireplaces or braziers, supposedly for the purpose. In Venice, letters were fumigated by using a metal sifter, a crivello, that you can see on the right, on top of a brazier. In some Lazzaretti, in order not to open the letters, as I mentioned before, cuts were made on paper to let the vinegar and the perfumes enter inside the letter without opening it. And here we have at the center and on the left 2 pictures of these devices, one from Trieste, from the quarantine center of Trieste, and one from Venice. Animal products were also carefully disinfected. Leather, similar to cotton, was usually left in the open in the courtyards of Lazzaretti. However, living animals were often part of the cargoes and needed to be quarantined and disinfected. Animals were not believed to transmit the disease to humans if they were sick, but seeds of the disease were believed to hide inside their fur and also feathers. In Trieste, a specific part of the Lazzaretto was dedicated to the quarantine of animals. Animals that were released from quarantine had to pass through a special door built into the water on the shore. And also a similar device was used in Lazzaretto of Malta that you can see in the map, circled in red. There is a sort of a door on the shore for the disinfection of animals. And on the left, you can see the quarantine station in Ancona, and in blue, the pool that was used to disinfect animals. Venetian regulation prescribed the quarantining of woolly animals and poultry, while animals with short hair were washed into the water by plunging them into it or by making them walk ashore. In Messina, the rules were very similar to those in Venice, where animals were quarantined only if woolly and with long hair, while poultry were disinfected with vinegar. And as I mentioned, in the Lazzaretto of Ancona, a pool was purposely built to disinfect different types of cargoes, including poultry and small animals, which were walked through the salty water. And a similar device was in general adopted in other Lazzaretti. And in general, it was severely forbidden to keep cats, dogs, birds, or poultry on the loose inside Lazzaretti, as they could escape and bring the plague to the city. And in a very sad example, in the Ancona Lazzaretto, the keeper had to kill his cat after he was reported to the health office. Touching animals in quarantine was also considered extremely dangerous. In the Lazzaretto of Livorno, for example, a passenger was removed from his quarantine group and put into isolation following accidental contact with a monkey, which jumped on his back. And again, in Livorno, a gazelle on the loose inside the quarantine center caused quite a stir. But what about non-contagious or less contagious goods? These were considered less dangerous, but they still had to undergo disinfection, especially if coming from the Levant. Given their smoother surface, for example, in the case of woods or metals, they were simply washed with seawater. In other cases, it was the cloth wrapping the bales that caused issues. A clear example is how beeswax was treated in the Venetian Lazzaretto of Split. The bales were usually disinfected in seawater for 48 hours in order to clean the surface, but above all, the cloth wrapping the bales. Given the extensive procedures adopted for the disinfection of goods, it is clear that goods considered dangerous needed to be touched and handled by porters and staff. And on the subject of plague and contagions, there were indeed as many anxieties surrounding the sense of touch as those concerning the sense of smell that I mentioned earlier. And this was also recently underlined by an article by Claire Turner. The sources underline that the interaction between the human body and specific objects was also mediated in the case of risk of contagion. A number of devices and instruments were used, employing especially materials considered safe from contagion. And an example, on 11 August of 1743, a Dutch ship arrived from Thessaloniki at the Lazzaretto of Varignano near Genoa. The captain was carefully interrogated on the journey of his ship, and the record of the interrogation states that, quote, "he swore by touching the sacred scripture, which were held by iron tongues by the custom of the custodi di sanità of this bay," end quote. This example not only clearly represents the fear of indirect contact and contagion, but also describes very carefully the material of the objects used. The scriptures were made of very dangerous materials, that is, paper, and were handled using iron tongues, which, due to their materials, were thought not to transmit the contagion to the health office. And we should imagine a device similar to the one showing here in this fresco that it depicts the courtyard of the Lazzaretto in Ancona, in which we see health officials either receiving or giving a letter with a sort of rod to someone in quarantine. The use of some sort of protective equipment was also recommended for staff. I did not find evidence of the use of the famous plague doctor costume, but there are some hints to the use of similar protective types of clothing. Indeed, according to modern medical theories, the skin was considered extremely porous, and porters and staff needed to be protected while working in close contact with goods. Clothes were coated with smooth substances such as wax or tar, which, as we saw, were considered especially safe from contagion. Porters in the Lazzaretti of Livorno were required to wear waxed gloves and shirts when opening bales and bundles of feathers. The inventory of the Lazzaretto in Genoa listed one waxed robe among its items. Similarly, during the plague in Florence in 1630 and 31, priests had to wear red waxed clothes, as happened before in Milan and Mantua during the plague in 1575 and 1577. In Rome, when the city was hit by the plague in 1656, doctors wore robes of waxed cotton. In 17th century Venice, pizzigamorti, that is body clearers, were provided with tarred clothes. And also the surfaces of objects of everyday use inside quarantine station were also coated to make them smoother and safer. In 1632, for example, the authorities advised the health office in Ancona to use wax to cover the wick of candles traded from Venice, where the plague was ravaging. And the wick was made of cotton, so considered dangerous. Tar was also used on ropes. In Livorno, food suppliers used tarred ropes to bring items to quarantine ships docked in the port, while in Venice, tarred ropes were used by pilots in case of ships coming from dangerous and infected places. Another solution often adopted inside Lazzaretti involved cleaning and disinfecting objects exchanged between people in quarantine in the outside world. And also the architecture was employed to keep the quarantine space safe. For this purpose, in the Lazzaretto San Leopoldo in Livorno, the canteen was built with a special serving hatch, here in red. And this serving hatch was used to exchange food and money. There were two communicating basins full of seawater, one on the staff side and the other on the passenger side, which were used to exchange coins and hand back cutlery while avoiding direct contact and also while disinfecting them in the process. A similar basin was also found in the nearby parlor with the label N. Passengers and staff in quarantine were usually allowed visitors, and the basin was used in case they needed to hand objects to those visiting from outside. A similar device was also present in the Lazzaretto in Marseille. And there are other several examples, including how religious practices were managed, that underline the importance of materiality, the interaction with body and the senses inside a quarantine space. But I don't have the time to explore them, but I would really enjoy answering your question on this if you want. And now, to conclude, I would like to draw some final remarks and conclusion on the topic of my presentation today. So I see the study of quarantine in the early modern Mediterranean as a complex subject made of different layers that I try to explore here. On one hand, we have quarantine that can be explored as a macro phenomenon, analyzing the transnational system of quarantine, the transnational cooperation, disease management, trade and politics, and also the relationship between East and West. On the other, it is also possible to investigate the institution by paying attention to the microcosm of the quarantine centers, to their practices, and to the medical framework that shaped the institution and that I tried to present it here. I argue that this microcosm is as important as the bigger picture, usually investigated by the scholarship, and I advocate for a cultural and social history of quarantine, which explores the medical framework, the key role of materiality, of goods exchange, these goods that were exchanged across the Mediterranean, and the relationship with the bodies in quarantine. By understanding these practices, we can understand why quarantine was applied in the first place, and also we can understand how public health measures impacted the wider Mediterranean region. Thank you.